Hey everyone. So in this video, we're going to talk about the importance of delaying the pelvis to improve spinal flexion. Okay. So if we're looking at a client, let's say they have some kind of spinal limitation or spinal complaint, when we're looking at a toe touch, for example, one of the key things that we look for is the ability of the client to delay the flexion of the pelvis. Because when you delay the flexion of the pelvis, it gives the spine a greater capacity to flex. Sometimes what you'll see early on in a toe touch, if the client struggles to flex their spine, you'll see this very early flexion of the pelvis where the spine and the pelvis flex as a unit, but the spine is expressing more of an extended position where they're more so hinging forward and not really expressing that capacity to distribute that flexion across the spine to get some length into the spinal extensors. Okay, so this is a great strategy. We're going to talk through an intervention here that we can utilize to try and concentrate more extension, or more flexion, I should say, across the spine and try and delay that flexion of the pelvis. Okay, so in this video here, we have the client positioned up against the wall with the knees slightly bent. With the femur slightly bent here, what it does is it gives the pelvis a greater capacity to extend or posteriorly tilt. Depending on the limitation that the client has, we may have to flex the knees even more so, okay, or flex the hips even more so to give the pelvis a greater capacity to extend there, so they can actually almost gently squash the lumbar spine against the wall. But the addition of the foam roller here is key because it gives us a much smoother strategy to facilitate that flexion of the rib cage over top the lumbar segments to be able to delay then that flexion of the pelvis. We eventually want the pelvis to flex, and we're not saying flexion of the pelvis or an anterior tilt of the pelvis is bad, but we don't want that to be the only strategy the client uses to distribute flexion across the spinal region. Okay, so what we're going to initially facilitate here is head flexion. Head flexion is then going to facilitate rib cage flexion, and we can facilitate that rib cage flexion even further by asking the client to gently reach the shoulders forward to facilitate a scapular protraction. That's going to help then facilitate that ribcage flexion even further. And then at different points of this flexion movement, we can ask the client to pause and gently build pressure down into humeral extension to try and get some load into the abdominals here. And just allow the client to experience that load through the abdominals at different points through the flexion range. Or we can apply a very gentle pressure through the hands into humeral extension and just move dynamically through a short range of motion. Okay, but we want to try and again, like I said, delay that pelvic flexion and slowly peel each segment off the wall to again be able to distribute that flexion across the spine instead of the pelvis. Okay, you'll always have clients that reach a point where they struggle to maintain the lumbar spine against the wall without that pelvis coming off. It's okay to allow the pelvis to come off eventually. Typically, we allow it to come off once the fingertips have reached the point of the knees. And sometimes clients that really struggle with it can still allow for the pelvis to come off the wall, which will mean the pelvis will ultimately be flexing. But again, just giving the client that experience of getting some load through the abdominals and trying to delay that can be a good starting point for many clients. Okay, and very, very simple for the clients to do at home as long as they have a foam roller. The foam roller is really key for this one because again, it just allows for that smooth reaching of the arm to facilitate that scapular protraction. Okay, so we're seeing to facilitate this coordination between the lumbar spine and the pelvis, we're ultimately trying to flex the lumbar spine without the pelvis flexing too quickly. So we need to facilitate that head flexion, the rib cage flexion, which we can do through the reach, through scapular protraction. Then we want to try and facilitate that lumbar spine flexion with delayed pelvic flexion. And then the pelvis will ultimately flex with the lumbar spine. Okay, so when people think of pelvic flexion or an anterior tilt, they often always think about the pelvic tilt forward or flexion coupling with an extension of the lumbar spine. But it can also flex with a flexed lumbar spine. That's what we're trying to facilitate here with the toe touch. And that will allow us to facilitate then a nice lengthening through the proximal hamstrings in the later phases of the toe touch. If your client is experiencing a stretching sensation through the proximal hamstrings very early in the toe touch, then it may be a case where the pelvis is flexing too quickly. Just as an example, it doesn't always mean that, but again, it gives you a nice general insight into what we're looking for objectively during the toe touch, because there's lots of moving parts during the toe touch. But if we can concentrate on the general coordination between segments, it'll give us much more information about what we can use then to try and facilitate a change in coordination. What is our intention with the intervention? In this intervention, we're trying to distribute flexion across the spine and delay that pelvic flexion, so that we can allow for the spinal extensors to actually lengthen without the pelvis just bringing everything into flexion as one unit early on.